I'll keep it conversational, psychologically grounded, and original rather than copying Matthew Hussey's exact voice. Here's the expanded first segment. One of the biggest mistakes we make in relationships is assuming that love works like a transaction. We think, if I do enough for him, if I give enough, if I'm supportive enough, thoughtful enough, available enough, eventually he will realize how valuable I am, and that will make him loyal. But human attachment doesn't work that way. And this is where we need to understand something uncomfortable. A person can appreciate everything you do for them and still not become deeply attached to you. He can be grateful for the meals you cook. He can appreciate the messages you send. He can notice that you remember the little things. He can know that you would go out of your way for him. He can even tell you sincerely, "I don't know what I would do without you." And yet none of those things by themselves guarantee emotional loyalty. Why? Because people don't experience relationships as a spreadsheet. They don't lie in bed at night calculating, "She did 17 thoughtful things this month, therefore I am now emotionally committed to her." We experience relationships through emotion, through memory, through meaning, through the feeling of who we are when we are with another person. And that distinction is incredibly important, because if you believe that love is primarily about what you do for someone, you can easily fall into the trap of overfunctioning in a relationship. You start giving more whenever you feel uncertain. You become more available when you sense distance. You sacrifice more when you fear losing him. You try harder when you feel that his interest is fading. And underneath all of that is a very understandable question. What else can I do to make him choose me? But perhaps the better question is, what does this relationship feel like for both of us? Because that's where attachment begins to become much more interesting. Think about the people you remember most strongly from your own life. You probably don't remember every favor they did for you. You don't remember every conversation word for word. You may not even remember what they bought you or exactly what they said on a particular Tuesday 3 years ago. But you remember how you felt around them. You remember the person who made you feel interesting. You remember the person who made you feel understood. You remember the person around whom you could laugh without monitoring yourself. You remember the person who challenged you without humiliating you. You remember the person who could sit with you in silence and somehow make the silence feel comfortable. And you remember the person who made you feel like you could breathe. That is not accidental. Psychologically, some of our strongest relational memories are connected not simply to events, but to the emotional states associated with those events. The brain doesn't merely record, "This person brought me coffee." It begins to associate that person with a broader experience: comfort, warmth, care, excitement, safety, admiration, belonging. And this is why you can sometimes do everything right and still fail to create the connection you're hoping for. Because behavior matters, but meaning matters more. You could give someone 100 gifts, but if they constantly feel judged around you, the gifts don't erase the emotional experience. You could send beautiful messages every morning, but if every conversation eventually becomes a test of whether they love you enough, the messages begin to carry pressure rather than warmth. You could make enormous sacrifices, but if those sacrifices later become evidence in an argument, "After everything I've done for you," then what looked like generosity has quietly become a debt. And nobody wants to feel like they are living inside someone else's accounting system. This doesn't mean you shouldn't care for a man. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be thoughtful. It doesn't mean you shouldn't show affection. Of course you should. The point is that your actions should be expressions of love, not attempts to purchase security. That is a profound difference. When you give because you genuinely want to give, there is freedom in the gesture. When you give because you secretly hope the other person will finally become afraid of losing you, the gesture carries anxiety. And people can feel that difference. This is why one of the most powerful things you can bring into a relationship is not endless effort, but emotional consistency. Can he trust the emotional environment between you? Can he tell you something vulnerable without immediately feeling judged? Can he disagree with you without believing the relationship is suddenly in danger? Can he have a difficult day without having to perform happiness for you? Can he succeed without you feeling threatened by his success? Can he fail without you treating the failure as proof that he is inadequate? These questions take us much deeper than the surface-level idea of what does a woman do for a man, because eventually the relationship stops being about individual acts and becomes about the atmosphere those acts create. And atmosphere is powerful. Walk into one room and you immediately feel tension. Nobody has to say anything. You can feel that something is wrong. Walk into another room and you immediately relax. Again, nobody has to explain it. Relationships work in much the same way. There are people you can spend an entire evening with and somehow leave feeling emotionally exhausted. And there are people you can spend 20 minutes with and somehow leave feeling more like yourself. That difference matters, and if you're constantly asking yourself, what more can I do for him? I want you to pause for a moment, because perhaps you've been trying to solve an emotional problem with behavioral effort. Maybe you're sending more messages because you're afraid he is pulling away. Maybe you're becoming more accommodating because you're afraid he'll lose interest. Maybe you're trying to become indispensable because you don't feel secure being simply loved. But being indispensable is not the same as being cherished. If someone needs you because you manage their life, solve all their problems, constantly reassure them, and carry the emotional weight of the relationship that can create dependence. But dependence isn't the same thing as devotion. Real connection is different. Real connection says, I don't need you to do everything for me. I value who you are. And that is a much more powerful position to occupy, because eventually a healthy relationship has to move beyond what each person can extract from the other. It has to become about what the two people experience together. Do we feel respected? Do we feel seen? Do we feel emotionally safe? Do we inspire one another? Can we be playful? Can we be serious? Can we tell the truth? Can we grow? Can we maintain our individuality while still creating something shared? Those are the questions that determine whether a relationship becomes a place someone merely visits or a place they emotionally belong. And notice something else. When you stop trying to earn love through constant giving, you don't become less loving. You actually become more capable of loving from a place of strength. You can give without keeping score. You can care without abandoning yourself. You can support him without becoming responsible for his happiness. You can be generous without becoming desperate to be needed. And paradoxically, that often creates a much healthier emotional dynamic, because now your love is no longer saying, look at everything I do. Please don't leave. It's saying, I choose to bring something beautiful into your life, but I don't have to destroy myself to prove that I deserve a place in it. that is self-respect. And self-respect changes the entire psychology of a relationship. So when we say men don't care what you do for them, we shouldn't interpret that literally. Of course they care. They care about kindness. They care about affection. They care about support. They care about effort. But those things become meaningful because of what they communicate. A thoughtful gesture can communicate, I see you. Support can communicate, I believe in you. Affection can communicate, you matter to me. Respect can communicate, I don't need to control you to feel secure. And that is why the deepest impact isn't created by the quantity of what you give. It is created by the emotional meaning behind what you give. Because at the end of the day, people rarely fall deeply in love with a list of things someone has done. They fall in love with the experience of being known, respected, appreciated, and emotionally alive in someone's presence. And that brings us to the next question, the one that becomes even more important. What happens when a man doesn't just enjoy what you do for him, but begins to feel that around you, he can actually be himself? Because that is where appreciation can begin to transform into attachment, and that is where loyalty starts becoming something much deeper than gratitude. So stop asking, what more can I do to make him stay? Ask instead, what does it feel like to be loved by me? And what does it feel like for me to love him? Because love isn't secured by how much you give, here's the second segment designed to flow directly from the previous point and set up the final section on self-respect and loyalty. And this is where we arrive at something even deeper, because once you understand that people remember how they feel in a relationship, you have to ask a more important question. What does it actually mean for someone to feel like they can be themselves with you? Because there is a difference between being comfortable with someone and being emotionally safe with them. Comfort is easy. Emotional safety is much harder. You can be comfortable with someone because you know what they expect from you. You know what to say. You know how to avoid conflict. You know which parts of yourself they like, but that isn't necessarily intimacy. Sometimes what we call a good relationship is actually just two people becoming very good at managing each other's expectations. And that can look perfect from the outside. There are no arguments, no dramatic conversations, no obvious problems. But underneath it, one person may constantly be thinking, if he knew what I was really thinking, would he still love me? That question tells you everything. Because genuine intimacy begins when you no longer feel that love depends upon performing a particular version of yourself. And this is important for both men and women. A man doesn't necessarily need a woman who agrees with everything he says. He doesn't need someone who constantly reassures him that he's right. He doesn't need someone who makes his life frictionless. What he needs, like any emotionally healthy human being, is the experience of being accepted without being controlled. There is a profound distinction between acceptance and approval. Acceptance says, I see who you are. Approval says, I will only be happy with you if you behave in the way I want. Those are completely different messages, and relationships become suffocating when one person begins to believe that love is conditional upon performance. Maybe he has a bad day. Maybe he's quieter than usual. Maybe he needs some time alone. Maybe he makes a mistake. Maybe he has an opinion that you don't share. Maybe he doesn't respond exactly the way you expected. And suddenly, instead of experiencing the relationship as a safe place to be human, He experiences it as an environment where every imperfect moment can become evidence against him. Now, let's be very clear. Emotional safety does not mean having no standards. This is where people sometimes misunderstand the concept. Being emotionally safe does not mean you tolerate disrespect. It doesn't mean you excuse dishonesty. It doesn't mean you accept betrayal. It doesn't mean you become endlessly patient with someone who refuses to take responsibility. And it certainly doesn't mean becoming the woman who says, "I'll accept anything because I want him to feel comfortable." That's not emotional safety. That's self-abandonment. Real emotional safety requires boundaries. In fact, healthy boundaries are part of what makes emotional safety possible. Because when a person knows that you can tell the truth without destroying them, and that you can also walk away from behavior that violates your values, they begin to understand something very powerful. Your love is not manipulation. You're not pretending everything is okay just to keep them. You're not threatening to leave every time you're disappointed. You're not staying regardless of how you're treated. You're simply saying, "I care about you and I also respect myself." That creates clarity, and clarity is deeply attractive because it removes the psychological game. There is no need to constantly decode you. There is no need to wonder which version of you is going to appear today. There is no need to earn basic kindness. He knows where he stands, and you know where you stand. That is one of the foundations of trust. Now think about what happens when a man experiences that consistently. He begins to associate the relationship with psychological freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, freedom from performance. That's a very different thing. He can tell you, "I'm struggling," without immediately feeling weak. He can say, "I don't know," without feeling like he has failed some invisible test of masculinity. He can tell you that something hurt him without worrying, that you'll use his vulnerability against him later. He can admit that he's afraid. He can talk about uncertainty. He can make a mistake and know that the mistake will be addressed without his entire character being put on trial. And when someone experiences that, something happens internally. They stop merely enjoying your company. They begin to associate you with a version of themselves that feels more authentic, and that is powerful. Because most people spend enormous amounts of their lives performing. At work, you perform competence. In social situations, you perform confidence. Around strangers, you perform politeness. Online, you perform an edited version of your life. And then you come home, and ideally, you want somewhere you don't have to perform at all. You want somewhere you can exhale. That is what emotional intimacy can provide. And if a relationship becomes that place, it can carry an enormous emotional significance. But here's the part I really want you to understand. You don't create this environment by constantly making a man comfortable. You create it by becoming emotionally honest yourself. Because if you're terrified to say what you need, you cannot create genuine intimacy. If you're secretly angry but pretending everything is fine, you're not creating safety. If you're constantly testing him instead of communicating with him, you're not creating safety. If you expect him to read your mind, you're not creating safety. And if you're using withdrawal, jealousy, guilt, or emotional punishment to get reassurance, you're creating uncertainty. You might get his attention, but attention is not intimacy. You might get a reaction, but a reaction is not devotion. You might even get him to chase you, but being chased is not the same thing as being deeply known. This is where mature love becomes different from romantic strategy. The goal isn't to become so mysterious that someone spends all their time trying to figure you out. The goal is to become so emotionally grounded that you don't need to create confusion to feel valuable. You can say, "That hurt me." You can say, "I need more communication." You can say, "I don't agree with that." You can say, "I love you, but I won't accept this behavior." And you can say those things without turning them into threats. That is emotional maturity. And ironically, emotional maturity often creates more attraction than constant emotional intensity. Because intensity can make people feel alive, but safety gives them somewhere to stay. Think about that. Intensity says, "I can't stop thinking about you." Safety says, "I don't have to be afraid of you." Intensity can create chemistry. Safety can create trust, and long-term relationships need both. Now, there's another side to this. A man doesn't only want to feel accepted. He also wants to feel respected, and this distinction matters enormously. There is a difference between saying, "I accept you as a human being," and saying, "I approve of every decision you make." You can love someone deeply and still challenge them. In fact, sometimes the person who loves you most is the person who refuses to let you hide from yourself. But the difference is in how that challenge is delivered. Contempt says you're pathetic. Respect says, "I know you're capable of more." Control says, "You will do what I say." Love says, "I'm not going to make your choices for you, but I will be honest about what I see." That distinction can completely transform a relationship. Because the healthiest partner doesn't become your prison guard, they become your mirror. They show you yourself without constantly trying to manipulate the reflection. And when a man feels that he can be seen by a woman without being diminished by her, something very significant can happen. He doesn't just feel liked, he feels understood. And being understood is one of the rarest experiences in human relationships. Think about how powerful it feels when someone says something about you that you have never been able to articulate yourself. You think, "Yes, that's exactly what I've been feeling." That moment creates connection because, for a second, another person has entered your internal world. That is intimacy, not constant texting, not endless attention, not doing everything for someone. Intimacy is being known. And the paradox is that the more you try to make someone love you by performing perfectly, the less authentic the relationship becomes. Because now they're not really meeting you. They're meeting the version of you that you think will keep them. And eventually that becomes exhausting. You become exhausted from maintaining the image. They become confused because they don't understand why the person they fell for seems to be changing. And resentment begins. This is why the strongest relationships aren't built by becoming everything someone could possibly want. They're built when two people can say, "This is who I am, this is what I need, this is what I can offer, this is what I won't accept." And if we choose each other, let's choose each other honestly. That kind of relationship has something rare. Dignity, and dignity is what allows love to breathe, because love without freedom becomes possession. Love without honesty becomes performance. Love without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. But love with honesty, freedom, and respect becomes something much more powerful. It becomes a place where two people don't have to disappear in order to belong. And perhaps that's what a man remembers most deeply. Not that you made his life easy. Not that you solved every problem. Not that you constantly praised him. But that around you, he didn't have to pretend to be someone else to be worthy of love. He could be ambitious and still admit fear. He could be strong and still be vulnerable. He could be imperfect and still be respected. He could disagree with you and still feel connected to you. He could be himself without feeling that being himself meant losing you. And when someone experiences that, the relationship becomes more than a source of pleasure. It becomes a source of psychological belonging. And now we can understand something even deeper. Because if a relationship allows a man to be himself, the next question isn't simply whether he feels good around you. The next question is, who does he become because of the relationship? Does he become smaller, more dependent, more passive, more afraid, or does he become stronger, more honest, more courageous, more responsible, more alive? Because that is where appreciation becomes something far more powerful. That is where a relationship begins to influence identity. And that is exactly where we need to go next. Because the deepest loyalty isn't created when someone thinks, "She does so much for me." Absolutely, here's the final segment, carrying forward the ideas of emotional experience and authenticity into the deeper question of **, self-respect, growth, and genuine loyalty **, while keeping the voice original rather than directly imitating Matthew Hussey. And this is where the whole conversation becomes more profound. Because if a man feels understood around you, if he feels emotionally safe around you, if he doesn't have to constantly perform some version of himself just to maintain your approval, then eventually another question begins to emerge. Who does he become when he is with you? Because the deepest relationships don't simply change how we feel. They change how we see ourselves. And that is one of the most overlooked truths about attraction and loyalty. We often ask, "Does he love me?" But a more revealing question is, who does he become in this relationship? Does he become more courageous, more honest, more responsible, more ambitious, more emotionally mature? Does he feel inspired to confront the parts of himself he would rather avoid? Or does he become smaller, more dependent, more passive, more entitled, more afraid of failure, because a relationship can make you feel good without necessarily making you better? And those are not the same thing. Comfort is valuable, but comfort alone cannot sustain a meaningful life. There are relationships where two people make each other feel wonderful, but never challenge each other to grow. They become a refuge from the world, but eventually that refuge becomes a hiding place. And then there are relationships where two people provide something more powerful. They provide both acceptance and elevation. They say, "I accept you as you are, but I also see who you could become." That combination is rare. And when someone experiences it, it can create a very deep form of loyalty. Because now the relationship isn't simply associated with pleasure. It's associated with possibility. Think about the people who have had the greatest influence on your life. Often, they're not the people who simply told you how amazing you were. They're the people who saw something in you that you hadn't fully seen in yourself. Maybe they said, "You're capable of more." Maybe they challenged you to stop making excuses. Maybe they believed in you when you were uncertain. Maybe they refused to let you define yourself by your worst mistake. Maybe they looked at you and saw potential where you saw limitation. That kind of influence can change a person's identity. And this is where a woman can have an enormous impact on a man's life, not by becoming his mother, therapist, manager, or savior, but by being someone whose presence invites him to respect himself more. Notice the difference. You are not responsible for creating his character. You are not responsible for fixing his wounds. You are not responsible for motivating him to become an adult. A grown man must take responsibility for himself. But there is something powerful about being with someone who makes you want to rise to your own standards, not because they demand perfection, but because their presence makes mediocrity feel less satisfying. That's very different from control. Control says, become who I want you to be. Inspiration says, become the best version of who you already are. And those two experiences feel completely different. One creates resistance, the other creates ownership. And people are much more loyal to what they have chosen than to what they have been forced into. That's why trying to manage someone into becoming a better partner often fails. You can monitor his behavior, you can remind him constantly, you can criticize him, you can threaten to leave. You can explain again and again what he should be doing. But if the motivation is entirely external, he may change temporarily without ever truly transforming. The moment the pressure disappears, the old behavior returns, real growth has to become internally owned. And the healthiest relationship creates an environment where that ownership can develop. You don't say, I will make you successful. You say, I believe you are capable of success, and I will not participate in the excuses that keep you from it. You don't say, I will solve your emotional problems. You say, I will listen to you, but I won't take responsibility for emotions that belong to you. You don't say, I'll protect you from every consequence. You say, I care about you enough to let you face the consequences of your choices. That is love with boundaries. And it is one of the most mature forms of love there is, because sometimes we confuse loving someone with making their life easier. But making someone's life easier is not always loving them. If you constantly rescue someone from the consequences of their behavior, you may be protecting them from the very experience that would force them to grow. If you constantly reassure someone who refuses to take responsibility, you may be soothing them without helping them change. If you constantly give more because they give less, you may be teaching them that they don't have to meet you halfway. And then one day you look around and realize something painful. You have become essential to their comfort, but irrelevant to their growth. That's not the kind of loyalty you want, because being needed is not the same as being valued. Someone can need your labor, need your attention, need your money, need your emotional support, need your constant reassurance, and still not truly appreciate the person you are. That's why you have to be careful about building your identity around being indispensable. Because if your entire value comes from how much you do for another person, you will eventually become afraid of their independence. And that's the paradox. You say you want a strong partner, but if your identity depends on being needed, their strength can make you feel unnecessary. So you start doing more, fixing more, giving more, controlling more, and slowly, without realizing it, love becomes a competition over who needs whom more. But healthy love isn't about creating dependence. It's about creating partnership, two complete people choosing to build something together. And that's why the most powerful thing you can give someone may not be what you do for them at all. It may be the space to become more of themselves, to pursue their purpose, to develop their strengths, to maintain friendships, to have ambitions that don't revolve around you, to experience a sense of identity outside the relationship. Because love becomes much stronger when two people choose each other freely. If someone cannot leave because their entire emotional world depends on you, that's not necessarily loyalty. But if someone has a full life, real choices, independence, and still says, I choose you. That choice carries enormous meaning. And that is the kind of loyalty worth having. Now, this is where we have to talk about self-respect. Because if you want to be with someone who respects himself, you have to respect yourself too, and self-respect isn't walking around acting superior. It isn't pretending you don't care. It isn't withholding affection to make someone chase you. It isn't becoming emotionally unavailable so that you can feel powerful. Self-respect is much quieter. It's the ability to say, I love you, but I will not betray myself to keep you. That's powerful. It means you don't have to become smaller to make someone comfortable. You don't have to silence your needs. You don't have to accept disrespect because you're afraid of being alone. You don't have to compete for basic attention. You don't have to constantly prove that you're worthy of being chosen. You can love someone deeply and still have a life that belongs to you. And something fascinating happens when you live that way. You stop relating to someone from fear. You start relating to them from choice. And choice changes everything. When you choose someone because you want them rather than because you cannot function without them, your love becomes freer. Your affection becomes more authentic. Your boundaries become clearer. Your standards become healthier. And your presence becomes more valuable because it is no longer coming from desperation. You're not saying, please don't leave me. You're saying, I want to build something with you, but I will not abandon myself in the process. That is the kind of relationship where respect can survive. And respect is critical because attraction without respect eventually becomes unstable. You can have chemistry without trust. You can have passion without compatibility. You can have attachment without health, but long-term love requires something deeper. It requires admiration, not worship, not putting someone on a pedestal, admiration. The feeling that when you look at this person, you think, I respect how they live. I respect how they handle difficulty. I respect their values. I respect the way they treat people. I respect the person I become when I'm beside them. That last part matters enormously. Because imagine being with someone who constantly makes you ashamed of yourself. Eventually, you won't associate the relationship with love. You'll associate it with the version of yourself you don't like. But imagine being with someone who brings out your courage, someone who reminds you of your values, someone who encourages you to keep your word, someone who challenges you to become emotionally honest, someone who celebrates your success without making it about themselves, someone who can tell you the truth without trying to destroy you, someone who can love you without needing to own you. Now the relationship becomes connected to something bigger than romance. It becomes connected to identity. And when a relationship becomes part of the story, someone tells themselves about who they are, leaving it becomes emotionally significant, not because they are trapped, but because the relationship has meaning. That's the difference between attachment and possession. Possession says, I can't live without you. Meaning says, my life is richer because of what we have built together. And the second is far healthier. So when we say that men are loyal to one thing only, I don't want you to hear that as some simplistic rule about male psychology. There isn't one magical button that guarantees a man's loyalty. Men are individuals, women are individuals. Relationships are complicated, but there is a powerful principle underneath all of this. People tend to protect what gives their life genuine meaning. And if a relationship gives someone not only affection, but dignity, not only comfort, but growth, not only companionship but authenticity, then that relationship becomes difficult to replace, not because the person is irreplaceable in some fantasy sense, but because the experience is deeply meaningful, and that's why the goal should never be to become the woman who does everything for him. The goal is to become a woman who knows who she is, knows what she values, loves deeply without losing herself, and creates a relationship where both people become more fully themselves. Because eventually the question isn't, what did you do for him? The question is, what kind of life did you create together? Did he become more himself? Did you become more yourself? Did you both become more courageous, more honest, more alive, more capable of love? If the answer is yes, then you have created something much more powerful than dependence. You've created partnership. And that is the kind of bond that doesn't need constant proof. Because when someone respects who they are in the relationship, respects who you are, and respects what the two of you have built together, loyalty stops being something you have to beg for. It becomes a natural consequence of meaning. So don't spend your life trying to become impossible to leave. Become impossible to forget for the right reasons, not because you did everything for him, not because you sacrificed everything, not because he couldn't survive without you, but because beside you he discovered a relationship where he could be honest, respected, challenged, loved, and still remain fully himself. And that is the deepest form of loyalty.